Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm excited to introduce our speaker and the DCO's first webinar focused on data privacy. My name is Dan Casera, and I'm the project manager responsible for the Digital Credit Observatory, or the DCO. The DCO is an initiative housed at the Center for Effective Global Action, a research center at UC Berkeley. And with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the DCO was launched in 2016 to investigate the impacts, both positive and negative, of digital credit. To date, we've supported just over 30 projects across 15 countries. Last year, the DCO scope was expanded to include data privacy for digital financial services, a reflection of the increasing usage and the risks associated with that of big data, especially for the provision of credit. So today, we're excited to host our first webinar discussion on the topic, and we'll be focused on what we mean by data privacy, why you should care, and an introduction to a few of the tools in our privacy toolkit. Now, before I introduce our speaker for the day, a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, we plan to save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the discussion for questions, so please feel free to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, submit questions throughout the presentation. Second, this will be recorded, and so slides in the recording will be posted afterwards. And finally, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen in the ribbon. There should be a button that either says captions or CC, something to that effect, so that you can enable captions if you so desire. Now, with that, I'm excited to introduce Nitin Kohli. He is a postdoctoral scholar at SIGA, working with the DCO, and he researches topics that span privacy, fairness, and the manipulability of statistical and algorithmic mechanisms. Drawing on a combination of technical, legal, and social science scholarship, Nitin develops theory, tools, and frameworks that safeguard individuals while attending to the social and political context of their use. What that really means is I'm excited to have Nitin join us today. He's the perfect person to help us span both the theoretical frameworks for understanding privacy, but also the practical know-how that's needed for implementing privacy-preserving technologies in the real world. He's what we refer to as a triple bear here at Berkeley, the Golden Bears. He has a PhD and a master's degree in information and data science from UC Berkeley School of Information, as well as a bachelor's degree in mathematics and statistics from Berkeley. So 3 degrees from Berkeley. He's a triple bear. And like I said, excited to have Nitin here today. He's the perfect person to help us with this conversation. So Nitin, I'll turn it over to you to start sharing your slides and take it from here.
Wonderful. Thanks for the introduction, Dan. Hey, everyone. I'm Nitin. Like Dan said, I'm a postdoc here at Berkeley. And my work really spans applied mathematics and civil liberties. And I'm excited today to kind of bring those two worlds together to talk about data privacy and the future of financial services and financial inclusion. So let me share my screen. Hopefully this all works out. Wonderful. I can at least see my screen, so hopefully you all can too. And oops. And one thing I want to do before I get started is I have far more detail on these slides than I will talk through. And I purposely put more detail in these slides so that way when you all have it afterwards, if there are references or more details there, you all can take a look for yourselves. So when I'm talking through these slides, I won't go over everything on there. It's more a reference for you to have afterwards. So that being said, let's talk about privacy. So I kind of want to cover 3 topics today. The first is, before we talk about data privacy and financial inclusion, I really want us to kind of think a bit more rigorously and more precisely about what is privacy and kind of set some scaffolding that might help clarify discussion around it. After that, I want to then mention some privacy harms that can arise from the use of data for what we would typically call social good uses that nonetheless can cause harm to individuals and organizations. And then lastly, I want to wrap up by thinking about quantitative tools we can use to solve certain problems related to the computational aspects for data privacy. So let's talk about privacy more specifically now. And kind of just to set the stage, a lot of us in this field of digital financial services have really noticed an explosion in the amount of data-intensive applications that have been arising. Due to increased mobile phone penetration and the use of mobile money, we now actually have a lot more data and a lot more algorithmic tools to glean insight about things such as credit repayment, who's a good credit risk or not, and making more advancements in the field of finance and more just financial services. And at the same time, many of these tools also have been used for the purpose of targeting humanitarian aid or studying forced displacement as well. And we see this not only within the United States and the EU, but also in many low and middle income countries as well. And the use of big data, actually, even if we look back a decade ago, was actually at the top of mind for the United States White House, with a working group being formed to study the intersection of privacy and big data. With many privacy advocates worried that many of the things we do actually could be having unintended consequences for folks in developing countries. And with the resurgence of, I guess, with new tools that have emerged over the past 3 years, we see actually many of these concerns reinvigorated, particularly around tools that were used during the pandemic to study COVID cases, as well as the new issues posed by the influx of generative AI applications. So many of these concerns that we're seeing have resurfaced again. And we actually want to now look at these from a slightly more rigorous and formal standpoint. So the motivating question for today's talk is, in an era characterized by big data and machine learning, is it possible to have these two things simultaneously, privacy and innovation? And what we'll do is we're going to just develop some ideas throughout this talk and then revisit this question at the end. But this question actually begs a very important follow-up. What do we mean by this word privacy in general? Because depending on how we conceptualize it, we may get very different answers to this question. So what I want to do is actually pause for a moment, and I want you actually just for yourselves for like 20 or 30 seconds to think to yourself, if I told you to describe what privacy is, what would you say? So take a moment and ponder. It'll really help the next few slides if you do. All right, so hopefully you've had some time to have a think. And I want to talk about what privacy is, let me actually give some common answers we might hear in everyday usage. So oftentimes folks will talk about what privacy is by appealing to metaphors that they've seen in either literature or cinema, like movies. For example, we might think of privacy as being in relation to the Big Brother concept from 1984 in a world with total government surveillance. We may think about privacy being related to Kafka's trial in a world of the dossier society with bureaucratic infrastructure everywhere. We might think of privacy in terms of the Minority Report in a world where that we know the future with perfect certainty. And for that reason, autonomy is difficult. Other times when people ask what is privacy, we often get one-line responses, usually of the form, privacy is the right to be let alone, or it has something to do with control over our information. We might even say privacy is about secrecy sometimes. Sometimes folks will talk about privacy with regards to consent and data collection. Sometimes folks will even refer to privacy as being about an intrusion or a sphere amongst one's body, thought, or actions, and many more things. So the fact that privacy can be described in many ways is actually, we'll see, a blessing and not really a curse. But what I want to do is, as we move forward, is realize something. That many particular concepts of privacy that we think about are actually specific things that are meant to address a social ill at a particular time in history. So what do I mean by that? Let's look back at the United States from roughly around the 1890s to the 1970s. Well, during this time, there was the rise of photography and journalism. And with photography, now we could actually kind of freeze moments in time that were often fleeting outside of the area, right? I could take a picture of somebody's wedding, and for folks who weren't at the wedding, they would be able to see it. At the same time, with the rise of newspapers and publications, information could be spread more widely. So the combination of these two meant that images and moments could be spread more widely amongst individuals in society. But at the same time, there are some moments that we don't want really spread. And this actually led to the notion of what's called the right to privacy, where privacy was conceptualized in this 1890 Law Review article by Brandeis and Warren, known as the right to privacy, where they conceptualized privacy as a right to be let alone because they didn't want their image or likeness or whatever spread more generally. So our first concept of privacy as a right to be let alone really comes out of this specific era where we were concerned about photography and journalism spreading information more broadly. Now, if we fast forward to the 1960s a bit, we're actually going to see that this was a time in US history that was plagued by a lot of government distrust. So with Nixon's Watergate scandal and the wiretapping of Martin Luther King, there was already a certain level of distrust among certain government activities. At the same time, record-keeping systems within the government became computerized. So there were a lot of concerns around the digitization and the use of secret government systems to keep track of individuals. This led to then the notion of privacy as being related to control over information. So the idea of privacy as control over information really has to do with the existence of secret government keeping systems and secret decision-making systems. And that's far different than a privacy as a right to be let alone. Also, at the same time, there was a resurgence, or I guess there was the start of the reproductive rights era, where many of the issues of privacy got related to the issues of the human body. And all of these things are all encapsulated within the US to think about particular problems at particular points in history. So what that means is that when we think of privacy as one particular thing, it may not be the most pressing thing that exists right now, but it still may be. And we have to be careful and use context and nuance to reason about it. And if we think about concerns in privacy that come from the United States, we should often have humility here and realize that these may not be the same concerns that arise in low and middle income countries. For example, in a very seminal paper by Abebe et al., they note that data sharing norms in Africa are quite different than how we think of data sharing norms in the US and the EU. For example, in the United States, it's pretty common for us to collect statistics about a population and then share them more broadly. However, in some parts of Africa, some communities might view the sharing of information about their community to outsiders as a privacy violation, even if it's about information about the group and not a specific individual. Similarly, we know from other work that just privacy norms are different in general. For example, in this work by these two authors here, I don't want to mess up the names, we actually know that in the Arabian Gulf, common activities that we would see in the United States, such as being asked to present an ID card when buying pharmaceuticals at a grocery store or a drugstore, can be seen as a privacy violation in some countries because it's viewed as you're asking for too much information about somebody for a routine task. Now, what does this all mean when we kind of think about it? Well, this means that actions that we think that violate privacy really depend on the context. So very rigorous and nuanced privacy scholarship has to realize that context is always important. And what we're going to do is, as we talk about privacy for innovation in financial inclusion, we need to adopt that point of view as well. So here are some important things to just take away as we move on with this talk. The first is that while surveillance is often viewed as very harmful for privacy, surveillance is not automatically harmful for privacy in all cases. For example, within US search and seizure laws, there is a big difference between police coming to search your property with a warrant and without a warrant. With a warrant, we typically don't view this as a privacy violation, but without a warrant, it could be viewed as one. And even more so, this is actually true in international human rights law more generally, where privacy is described as a derogable human right. By derogable, we mean it's a right that can be infringed upon in certain situations, such as crisis situations. Whereas the right to life or right against torture is non-derogable, it can never be infringed upon no matter what. Privacy is allowed to be infringed upon sometimes in certain human rights settings. Additionally, why context matters is that we realize that privacy is more than the right to be let alone or about secrecy in general. Because if privacy were to only be about secrecy, for example, we can never let data flow anywhere, right? We have to be aware of the context and protect the integrity of the context along the way. And even more so, privacy is definitely more than just control over information and consent, right? For example, as we'll see later on in this talk, privacy harms can still happen even when folks give explicit consent for their data to be used. And there are some situations, like in public health, that may forego consent in certain situations. So what I want to do here is point out something, is when I say privacy is more than the right to be let alone, or more than secrecy, or more than consent, or more than control information, I'm not trying to say these don't matter. I'm trying to say that if we really, really, really want to attend to privacy, we have to be more flexible about our thinking about what conceptions of privacy we're working with. And for that, we need diversity of thoughts and diversity of views on what we're trying to protect against. So for this reason, because context matters, it's really hard to define privacy in the abstract as a singular thing. Because privacy is pluralistic. We saw that there are many conceptions of it. Privacy is inherently social too, meaning that it talks about individuals, groups of individuals, and so on. Privacy is contextual, as we've seen. Depending on certain situations, some norms might be more important than others. And privacy is what we call essentially contested. So much like questions about like, what is art or what is democracy, the fact that this term privacy can seem a little amorphous and fuzzy at times is actually a blessing, because it allows us to adapt the value over time as technology, norms, and societies change. So that means that for us, the critical component of our work has to be about finding an appropriate notion of privacy when we're looking at our particular setting. So in order to find this particular setting, it really helps us just to go back to the who, what, when, where, why, hows. For example, who is the one infringing upon privacy? What does this infringement look like? When did it occur, and where did this vulnerability come from? And why and how did it occur? By actually being less abstract and thinking not about privacy not as this highfalutin concept, but about something we can scaffold and work with tangibly, we can actually do a lot more good. So for the rest of this talk, I want to get super specific then, right? We're going to talk about data privacy that arises from the use of computational tools. So for example, one setting we're going to consider is the case where individuals give data to an institution. This can be like a census bureau or credit bureau. And the institution will compute on the data and release statistics to an observer, like a census bureau might do. They might release credit scores to individuals who they're computed on, and so on and so forth. So for the rest of this talk, we're going to talk about data privacy in computation. And what I really want to do is we're going to tease this out more is why we're focusing on the data part of privacy here. And that's because when we look at this computational setting, data is one particular stopgap where we can actually stop from learning about individuals more deeply than what's necessary. Because we can actually learn about individuals' associations, their behaviors, their belief, their past decisions that go well beyond what is necessary for the task at hand. And we're going to tease this out as we go more forward. So we care about data privacy because data can leak information about individuals that's beyond what's necessary for the task at hand. So let's talk about certain harms that can occur in this computational setting, given what we already know that privacy is contextual. So I want to talk about 5 privacy threats to individuals that can arise from various uses during computation. And I'm not going to say them right now because we're going to go through them. So let's run through this. So one threat to an individual can occur from their own data, actually. So let's imagine that we have a data set of locations. It turns out that location traces are actually very highly identifiable. Now, what do I mean by that? Think about how many people went from your house to your work today. Unless you happen to work with your partner or your roommate, that answer is very likely 1. As we get more and more information about individuals, they tend to get more unique, right? Either they're just as unique as before, or they're more unique now. And individuals' own data can actually leak quite a bit of information about them more generally. For example, a visit to a gynecologist on one day, and then a visit to an expecting mother's clothing store 2 weeks later paints a very different picture than either one of those points in isolation. So when we have more data about individuals and we collect over time, we actually have the ability to learn more about an individual story as they traverse through life. A second threat to individuals come not from their own data necessarily, but from the fact that other people have similar data to them. For example, here are three very big headlines that were in the news within the past decade. It turns out the rule of statistics, right, that birds of a feather tend to flock together, is quite true. For example, Target was able to figure out that a teenage girl was pregnant, even though she never disclosed this information to her family members or to Target, because when looking at her purchase history, they noticed that she was purchasing items that were similar to the purchases made by other pregnant women. Similarly, the fact that we can use data from other people, such as genetic information, to learn about other family members, poses interesting questions for what it actually means to have control over your own information and for what consent looks like in places where statistical correlations link individuals to habits without us explicitly saying what we want or what we don't want released. The third threat that can come to individuals is actually not from the records themselves, but kind of the meaning of the database that it's housed in. So let's actually run through a very interesting example here. Ashley Madison is a website that was created for married individuals seeking to have affairs. And what happened was hackers actually hacked the Ashley Madison database and released it online. And so in this thing, we had information such as, like emails, credit card numbers, etc. However, while the credit card number and other thing, is pretty privacy invasive, the fact that you're in a database about people having affairs actually leaks a lot of information about you. It says at the very least, you were seeking to have an affair. So sometimes the social meaning of the data set you're in leaks information about you. Another example is if you're actually re-identified as being part of a study where individuals have a very rare disease, then we learn you have that rare disease. So in these cases, it's not really the individual record that did you harm, it's that you were involved in a database that has a certain social meaning attached to it. A fourth threat comes actually when we try to reverse engineer anonymization methods. Now, what do I mean by that? Many of us work with data sets where we don't have explicit identifiers on them, right? I maybe don't put down somebody's name. I don't put down their social security number. I don't put down certain aspects like this that are pretty blatantly identifiable. However, it turns out that just removing sensitive attributes is not really sufficient to protect privacy. Because here's why. There may be other attributes in the data set that are essentially so unique to you that we re-identify who you are. So in a very historic example, the medical data was released in Massachusetts that contained a person's zip code, their birth date, their sex, as well as other medical data such as their ethnicity, the visit date, their diagnosis, and so on. Professor LaTanya Sweeney, who was then a graduate student at the time, bought a voter registration database for, I believe, only $20. And this voter registration database had included individuals' names, their address, and so on, but also had these three columns of zip code, birth date, and sex that she then used to join on the medical record, medical data set. And when she was able to join on these for those unique ones that had unique zip codes, birth date, and sex, she's able to then attach a name to them. So even though no name was in the medical data set, the fact that zip code, birth date, and sex were sufficiently unique in this data set allowed her to attach a name to it. We actually saw this also happen in Netflix data as well. That led to actually the FTC basically giving Netflix a very stern warning saying you cannot release anonymized data that doesn't have a real privacy guarantee. And the last threat to individuals' data comes from the fact that maybe we can rebuild the data from sources that don't look like classic data, quote unquote. So what do I mean by this? Well, suppose I have a super secret database and I'm worried about the privacy implications of records being leaked in it. So instead of actually releasing anonymized records, which we know don't really have a provable privacy guarantee from the examples before, what if we instead release statistics about the data set? That way people can still hopefully learn from it. So I'm going to give a toy example here that hopefully we learn from. Suppose I tell you that there are two individuals in this data set. And I give you some information about the number of years of schooling they have and their credit score. And we ask kind of the suggestive question, rather than doing statistics where we have a database and we compute summary information, can I use the summary information to actually reverse engineer the underlying database? Because if we can, this kind of contravenes about why we didn't want to release the database in the first place. And it turns out in some settings, the answer is yes. So let's kind of run through this with some basic maths here. So I already know that there's 2 individuals in this data set, and I'm looking at information about years of schooling completed and their credit score. So I can kind of start with this blank database here. I know we'll have 2 rows and 2 columns. Next thing I'll do is I'll actually use the fact that we know that the average is the balance point of the distribution. So the average of 16 tells us that it's the balance point of the schooling distribution, and 760 is the balance point of the credit distribution. And using the fact that population standard deviation tells us the typical distance from the average, and there's only 2 people, we learn that the only 2 data points in the database must be a combination of 14 with 18 and 730 with 790. So there are only 2 possibilities here now. And using the fact that the correlation between these is positive means low numbers stay with low numbers and high stay with high, we resolve the ambiguity here and deduce that the first data set is actually the super secret database that we were working with. So in this situation, we were able to completely reverse engineer the underlying data, even though I just gave you some summary statistics. Now, a common critique of this might be, well, Nitin, like you kind of rigged this example to work. It's very small numbers of people. There's a lot of statistics here. Sure, I rigged it. I'm not going to lie about that. But what we find is that this actually occurs in practice. For example, in the US Census, it was found out in their 2010 release of census information that if you use 5 characteristics, the census block, an individual's sex, their age, their race, and their ethnicity, you could reconstruct 46% of the US population's records just from those alone. That yields reconstruction of around 142 million people. And another thing we find is if we use our information about threat 4, that we can oftentimes attach names to things. Using auxiliary data, we were able to attach names to 52 million folks as well. And at least in the United States, census information is supposed to be kept completely private. You're not supposed to be able to get access to these forms. So the fact that these information were actually reconstructible from the statistics poses grave privacy concerns. And luckily, we have a way around this known as differential privacy that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. But just to set the stage, reconstruction attacks are real. They weren't as fictionalized as that example I gave you before might seem. And in fact, they're often the case of pretty contentious legal debate as well. So these 5 privacy threats we've talked about show that even when I'm working with data, novel privacy harms can occur just from the ordinary usage or sharing or analysis of these data sets. In particular, we saw harms can arise from 5 places. From an individual's own data in isolation, when we use statistical correlations with other people's data, when we use information about the meaning of the data set that it's housed in, from auxiliary data sets that can de-anonymize, pseudo-anonymized data, and we can actually reconstruct individual data from population level statistics. And in order to protect against these things, we need both qualitative and quantitative protection mechanisms to do so. And what I'm going to do now is talk about what I think are some of the most important pets that we can use in financial services to help mitigate many of these threats that we've seen here. So let's talk about some quantitative tools now. I'm going to talk about 5 of them. And one thing I'm going to let you know is I don't have a lot of math on these slides. I have more pictures and intuition, but I have a summary table at the end that will kind of summarize a lot of the information I'm saying right now. So one possible tool we can use is known as differential privacy. So differential privacy works well when we're worried about computing privacy-preserving statistics. So in this example, we have an institution, you can think of it as like a census bureau, that collects census information about individuals, and they release outputs about how many folks live in a certain census block with certain characteristics. And what differential privacy does is it adds carefully crafted noise to ensure that anybody who looks at the private output can't learn too much about the underlying data set here. So repeating that again, differential privacy is great when you want to create privacy preserving statistics that don't leak too much information about the individuals in the data set. And the way it does this is by using very carefully crafted types of noise. You can't just pick any arbitrary noise and distribution and have it work. You have to be very clever with what you do. So this is great. So differential privacy works well when we have an institution that wants to release privacy preserving statistics. However, when we look at this picture, we kind of notice that it can be used for more things than just a census application. For example, we can use differential privacy for humanitarian response. Here's an example of some work that I've done where we use actually mobility statistics for based off of how people are moving between regions to get a feel for how well people are adhering to stay-at-home orders and how well non-pharmaceutical interventions can be used to stop the spread of COVID, for example. An alternative tool that could be used is what's known as local differential privacy. So unlike classic differential privacy where noise is added by the institution when creating a private output, local differential privacy actually adds noise to the information before the institution gets it. So rather than the institution ever getting raw data and computing on it, the institution only gets noisy information from individuals, and they can compute whatever they want on it. And this noise we add, once again, has to be carefully crafted. And it's carefully crafted to make sure that the data curator or the data analyst here cannot reverse engineer the individual's underlying data themselves. So whereas classic differential privacy is concerned about threats from an outside observer who sees statistics, local differential privacy is worried about when the data curator could be adversarial. Another exciting tool that can be used is what's known as homomorphic encryption. So let's pretend we have that database we saw before with years of schooling completed and credit scores. What we might do when we classically compute on a data set like this is we might pass it through some computation model and then get some information about it, right? We might get that the mean credit score was 760. Well, oftentimes data is often stored in an encrypted manner. And when we actually have encrypted data, one kind of curious idea would be, oh, if I want to compute on it, maybe I need to unencrypt it first and then go through the classic computation scheme. However, the act of decrypting creates an opportunity for an adversary who's eavesdropping to learn about the unencrypted data then during the computation step. So what we might ask then is it possible to create a computation scheme that can work on encrypted data such that we get the same answer without decrypting the underlying data first? And this is what homomorphic encryption does. It's quite clever, actually. Whereas classic computation works over unencrypted data, homomorphic encryption enables computation over encrypted data. Another interesting tool that can be used is what's known as secure party multi-computation. So secure multi-party computation can be used in situations where different organizations or different individuals want to jointly participate in a single computation to get an output, say the number of banked individuals within a region, without actually learning about the other bank's individual data themselves. So secure multi-party computation is great for situations where we want to jointly compute a function over multiple participants' data while ensuring that nothing else is revealed about the participants other than what we learned from the function itself. And in the interest of time, I'm actually going to kind of skip over this example I have. But if any of you would like me to talk about this during the Q&A, I'm more than happy to, and you'll also have the slides as well. And the last example of a very interesting pet that can be used is federated learning. So federated learning occurs when we try to train machine learning models in a decentralized manner. So in this example here, let's suppose I'm a bank and I want to figure out if we can somehow learn what features are predictive of an individual being late in their payments. So one thing you might do is say, do I have to actually collect all this data from individuals first, train it on my global server to build a model? and then learn about them? And the answer is not necessarily. What we could do is actually, we could build a local model such that information never has to leave, this raw information never has to leave the individual's device. We can send model updates back and forth between the server and individuals to train a global machine learning model to learn about predicting late repayments without actually ever needing to collect the underlying data themselves. And this is intuitively appealing for kind of a big reason. The institution never has to hold any data themselves. They only hold the machine learning model updates along the way. However, I want to point out that while this is appealing, decentralization by its own doesn't really have a provable mathematical guarantee. It has an intuitive appeal. But that being said, you can actually use federated learning with differential privacy or local differential privacy or homomorphic encryption or secure multi-party computation to end up getting more provable, rigorous guarantees on top of this. So the neat thing is you can use all these pets in combination with one another to enable different statistical tasks when you're worried about privacy threats coming from different areas. Because as we saw from the first part of this talk, the context of privacy matters. So when you're worried about privacy from whom, different contexts might have different potential adversaries. So it's our job to intelligently leverage these tools in ways to make sure we're protecting the right types of privacy harms. So let's return to our motivating question here, right? Is it possible to concurrently have privacy and innovation? And I want to take a very nuanced approach to this answer, right? In popular discourse, privacy is often treated as a binary. It's either something we claim we have or don't have. But that's not really true, right? We know that privacy can be described in many ways. And for this reason, it's not an all or nothing feature, right? And the fact that privacy has a diversity of concepts under its big umbrella is actually not a curse, but a blessing, because it means that we can find more appropriate notions of privacy to work in some situations over others, right? And what we know now is that we can use various technologies, such as the PET shows, as well as other policies and practices in conjunction with one another to actually holistically worry about the privacy harms for our particular setting, right? And because we can do this, we can tailor them to our domain-specific needs. So whenever we think about, is it possible to have things concurrently, we have to realize that privacy protections are not binary and they operate on a spectrum, right? And it's our job to intelligently leverage the fact that privacy exists on a spectrum to actually make sure we can try to have, I guess, Pareto improvements for privacy and innovation. And that's actually something the DCO is very interested in, right? At the DCO, we're very focused on understanding how different notions of privacy across LMIC contexts that are very under-researched can actually be used, and to figure out which are best fits for addressing their specific context needs, depending on the goals of individuals and policymakers. Great, so we actually have a white paper that was actually just posted online today that I highly encourage you all to check out. It has more information than I could ever put in a 30-minute talk. And I'm excited to actually get your questions on this topic because I've been thinking about privacy for 9 years at this point, and there's no way I could do it justice in 30 minutes. So I'm really hoping I can dig deeper with the questions you have during the Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you, Nitin. Let's see. So we have probably more questions that we're going to have time to cover here. So for anyone that submitted a question that we don't get to, please feel free to reach out afterwards, and we're happy to have a conversation. But just to start off, I'm gonna go with one question. I'm gonna combine a couple of questions that are very similar that we got. So essentially the spirit of this is, if we think about more restrictive policies that are meant to attend to data privacy, how will that interact with the use of alternative data and some of these models that fintechs are using? And particularly, what's the impact on access to credit and on the price of credit?
Sure. So I love this question for a bunch of reasons, but one thing I want to do before I actually answer this question is kind of give a little bit more historical framing on about how economic thinking and privacy have kind of had a weird intertwinements over time. There's this very historical paper from the late 70s, early 80s by the lawyer Richard Posner, who actually posited that privacy is quote unquote bad for markets because hiding information actually creates inefficiencies in the marketplace. Um, and unfortunately, that paper that was written was more like a conjecture and a thought piece and is not what we would consider by current day research standards to be research. But unfortunately, Posner's position in the field of law and economics greatly shaped how many economists think about privacy and information in markets today. And unfortunately, much work has not outgrown that type of viewpoint. So when we think about the role of privacy in markets and innovation and efficiency, I always like to say that we have to be very careful and think about specifically the context we're in, right? Because we could definitely imagine a world where regulation and policies are so restrictive that the price of credit rises because there's only very little information. So then low credit risk individuals have to essentially subsidize the risk of higher credit risk folks. But there are also other examples we know from history where actually privacy protections have been beneficial for the entire ecosystem at large. So we know that, for example, right? Like, yeah, we know like in fields of like mental health or substance abuse that oftentimes in order for individuals to share information, they need privacy guarantees first before they're willing to give up information. And in fact, this is why like many times, like in the US Census, for example, we say you have to fill out the census no matter what, because the collective good we get from it and the information gleaned is actually beneficial to the ecosystem more broadly. And it's our job as scientists, engineers, and policymakers to devise privacy tools and privacy policies that get the best benefit out of this. So these are like two very different views of the world. Posner's view of like, because people want to hide information, maybe, or regulation tends to hide information, we'll have lower quality models and stuff. But it could also very well be the case that if we engineer our systems intelligently, we might get higher quality information that can be gleaned from it along the way. So really, I would posit this as like the answer is it depends on how we're willing to engineer these systems ourselves. And I want to point like I think this is a great question for many of us to work on, to say in what ways can privacy solutions actually be engineered and constructed to encourage data sharing such that the collective benefits there don't fall into this information asymmetry trap from the late 70s, early 80s that pervades today.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is it's sort of accepted wisdom that more privacy is going to be bad for access and for prices, but that's actually not true, that it's sort of an open question. And you're sort of front running where I was going with my next question here. So again, for the interest of time, I'm going to try to combine a few, which makes this tough. I'm going to ask you to keep this a brief answer, and that might mean that folks need to follow up for more information. But where do you see the gaps, and what roles do you see funders playing? And someone just doing the Q&A also, the role of international bodies like the UN. So if there's any way in 60 seconds or less you can try to tackle that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So when thinking about funding in this space, I think there are a few things that folks can do. Some of these will be I'm going to echo some of the things I mentioned in the talk, right? Like when we focus about problems in this space and when funders want to work in the space, I really want to encourage funders to encourage work that thinks about richer concepts of privacy beyond just consent and control over information. I think it's great that we have a lot of studies that come out where people try to measure like individuals' willingness to share information for cash, like in exchange for money in a lab setting. That's cool, but I think we really need research beyond this now, right? A lot of the work I would like to see from funders is them funding work that actually characterizes the trade-off introduced when using privacy enhancing technologies in practice. So kind of the insider baseball is in academia. Oftentimes when we publish papers, like we have to like show our results against benchmark data sets that are open source for everybody to use, but aren't really realistic for what we see in practice. So I would really encourage funders to fund work where there's matchmaking involved, right? Where privacy engineers get to work with an organization in development or in a low and middle income country to actually then get rid of this engineering bottleneck to kind of forefront this work of then how we can accurately measure and understand these trade-offs when we actually have engineered solutions in place. So to kind of summarize this thought more coherently, I'd love to see funders kind of work with matchmaking to allow privacy engineers and privacy scientists work with folks who actually do work in financial inclusion and development on the ground. This type of work is, I think, underutilized, and it could be a great opportunity for us to learn from one another.
All right. I think you might have been around like 70 seconds there, but we'll give it to you. I know we can't see the participants on the webinar, but I want to join all of them in thanking you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending upon where folks are coming in from, and sharing this introduction. We put a link in the chat already, so people can see a white paper that Nitin just put out that goes into a lot more detail on some of these privacy enhancing technologies. And also to sign up for the webinar, we're going to have another kind of edition of this privacy enhancing technologies series, if you will. And it's going to talk through a specific example, a project he's working on, incorporating privacy preserving technologies into a system that was delivering humanitarian aid. So I think that'll be a really exciting conversation as well, and we hope we can join you. Or we hope you can join us, excuse me. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Hope everyone has a good day.